Oliver Blake could feel his heart beating rapidly in his chest, an erratic rhythm drumming loud enough, he imagined, to be heard clearly by passers-by on the busy streets of Manchester. It was an unusually warm afternoon, the kind that brought people outdoors to sit under cafe umbrellas, sipping tea, and sharing leisurely conversation. Yet for Oliver, the bustling life around him seemed muted, as if he stood isolated within a bubble of restless anticipation. His friends, eyes gleaming mischievously, surrounded him, their laughter and friendly teasing acting like a catalyst, intensifying his growing unease. "Come on, Oliver," encouraged Stanley Foster, a friend whose voice always carried the weight of charismatic authority, effortlessly persuading others to follow his whimsical suggestions. "You're always bragging about pulling off your legendary pranks. Surely you wouldn't hesitate now." Oliver's smile faltered slightly, betraying the thin veil of confidence he'd spent years perfecting. Stanley knew exactly how to press him, each word landing with pinpoint accuracy on Oliver's carefully constructed bravado. Nearby, the rest of their group stood waiting, their expressions a mixture of amusement and challenge. Oliver knew it would be unthinkable to back down now. Pride anchored him firmly to the moment, erasing any chance of retreat. He glanced over at a small crowd gathering around a street performer, an old man with eyes twinkling kindly, juggling effortlessly while a small dog sat patiently beside him, wagging its tail at every applause. For a moment, Oliver envied the simplicity and innocence of the scene. It reminded him briefly of childhood, before popularity had mattered so intensely, before acceptance was earned through risk and spectacle. The tiny dog met Oliver's gaze, and he felt an odd pang of guilt, quickly shaking it away as irrational. "All right," Oliver finally declared, summoning the remnants of his trademark bravado. "If you think I won't go through with it, you clearly don't know me at all." A round of applause erupted, his friends cheering him on as if he were a gladiator marching into battle, though beneath the laughter and the claps he sensed something darker, a thirst for entertainment at any cost. The challenge itself had seemed simple enough when initially suggested. A prank targeting one of the Queen's famous Royal Guards, those steadfast sentinels renowned worldwide for their unwavering composure. Oliver reasoned it would be harmless, a quick, humorous stunt that would earn him laughter, social media glory, and, crucially, affirmation among his peers. Yet now, as the moment drew closer, something uncomfortable began gnawing at the back of his mind, an instinctual warning whispering softly, yet urgently, "Tread carefully." His mind drifted momentarily to memories of his father, stern yet compassionate, always reminding him of a universal truth. Life has a way of balancing things out, Oliver. Remember, whatever you put out there comes back to you eventually. Oliver had always dismissed such notions as old-fashioned wisdom, irrelevant to a modern, daring lifestyle. Yet now, inexplicably, those words echoed hauntingly through his thoughts. Shaking off the strange unease, he forced his feet forward, beginning the short but weighted walk towards Stanley's car, which would soon whisk him away to Windsor Castle. Every step echoed with invisible consequences, each stride tugging at some unspoken yet tangible thread of destiny. Oliver brushed aside these nagging feelings, attributing them to nerves and the silly superstition of a momentary hesitation. During the car journey, Oliver stared silently out of the window, watching trees and buildings blur past. His reflection stared back at him, distorted by the movement and glass, resembling something unfamiliar, fragile, vulnerable. Stanley, sensing the shift in Oliver's mood, turned the music louder, drowning out any doubt lingering within the confines of the car. When the vehicle finally halted near Windsor Castle, Oliver stepped outside, inhaling the distinctly regal atmosphere surrounding him. The ancient fortress loomed imposingly, its stone walls steeped in history, pride, and dignity. Something inside him stirred with respect, yet his determination to prove himself, his craving for validation, overshadowed it. He scanned the area cautiously, spotting tourists holding cameras, families laughing together, and guides speaking animatedly about royal history. Then he saw him, the guard motionless and proud, standing vigilantly at his post. A sense of unease grew sharper, tempered now with guilt as he observed the guard's commitment, his proud, disciplined stance a stark contrast to Oliver's frivolous intent. Steeling himself, Oliver crossed the square, passing close enough to catch the guard's solemn expression. His eyes betrayed nothing, yet Oliver sensed a deeper emotion beneath that stoicism, one he couldn't fully interpret, yet it tugged inexplicably at his conscience. As Oliver approached, he felt his heart clench tightly, a final plea from his conscience to reconsider. It was then that his gaze fell again on another figure nearby, an elderly woman, gently stroking the head of her faithful Labrador. Her frail fingers were tender, rhythmic strokes soothing both the dog and Oliver's turbulent thoughts. Suddenly, the dog looked up, its eyes catching Oliver's once more. Those eyes, warm, gentle, and trusting, triggered another unexpected wave of empathy within him, a longing for innocence he'd left behind somewhere along the path of life. Ignoring the sudden rush of sentimentality, Oliver forced himself back into the prankster persona, the mask slipping into place once more. His friends stood at a safe distance, their phones already raised, ready to capture the moment. Oliver hesitated one final second, his instincts screaming louder, warning him against disturbing the sacred quiet around the guard's solemn duty. But the allure of validation, the anticipation of instant recognition, admiration, acceptance, proved stronger. With an exaggerated theatrical movement, Oliver stepped closer, mimicking the guard's posture absurdly, his friends instantly bursting into laughter. Oliver felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it vanished almost immediately. Something was wrong. Horribly wrong. In the guard's rigid composure, Oliver glimpsed a flash of genuine distress, an almost invisible shift beneath the carefully disciplined exterior. Oliver froze, suddenly overwhelmed by the realization that his action, intended as harmless amusement, had deeply wounded someone committed to solemn duty. The world seemed to pause, trapping Oliver in a cruel spotlight of consequence. Around him, laughter echoed hollowly, piercing through the facade of comedy, exposing the deeper, painful truth of the moment. Oliver's heart sank, crushed by the unbearable weight of regret. He caught sight once again of the elderly woman and her dog, their peaceful expression twisted now into confusion, disappointment, and subtle sadness. The Labrador's eyes held none of the earlier warmth, replaced instead by a heartbreaking look of judgment and betrayal. Oliver had unwittingly tarnished a delicate balance, a silent agreement between humanity, duty, and respect. He realized with agonizing clarity that he'd crossed a line from harmless humor into painful disrespect. As Oliver stood paralyzed, the weight of his recklessness crushing him, a crowd began to gather, faces turned toward him, accusing, judging. Suddenly, his father's words echoed back sharply in his mind, chilling him with stark clarity. Life balances things out. A bitter sense of karma clawed at Oliver's heart, squeezing painfully, mercilessly reminding him of every careless decision he'd ever made. His friends' laughter faded to silence, confusion now etched onto their faces as Oliver felt an intense, irreversible shift occurring within himself. He turned, meeting the guard's stoic gaze one final time, feeling the piercing intensity behind that disciplined exterior, realization dawning in Oliver's heart that, in this impulsive act, he'd done irreparable harm. As he stood in the spotlight of judgment, a single question echoed powerfully in Oliver's mind, taunting him relentlessly. Had he pushed too far this time? It was clear in the heavy silence around him that consequences awaited, dark, inevitable, and just beyond the horizon. Oliver Blake stood frozen in the shadows cast by the towering stone walls of Windsor Castle, his breath ragged, heart hammering violently against his ribcage, as if desperately attempting escape. He felt as though an invisible noose tightened steadily around his throat, constricting each gasp, each panicked intake of air becoming more labored than the last. Only moments ago, everything had seemed so harmless. Just another prank, another viral sensation he could laugh about later with friends over a pint. But now, reality pressed upon him with ruthless precision, delivering a lesson he had never intended to learn. The afternoon sun, once comforting, now burned relentlessly onto Oliver's pale skin, forcing beads of sweat to run cold trails down his spine. All around him, the previously cheerful murmur of tourists and families had transformed abruptly into shocked gasps and pointed accusations. Their faces blurred momentarily in Oliver's vision, shifting into an indistinct sea of condemnation. He saw them shaking their heads in stern judgment, murmuring disapprovingly, their eyes glaring at him. Eyes that accused without mercy, eyes filled with disappointment and righteous anger. Oliver felt their gaze penetrate deep within him, igniting shame like a fire he could not extinguish. Turning desperately, his eyes found the one figure he had targeted, the steadfast Royal Guard, standing immobile, yet somehow altered now, his eyes fixed forward, disciplined as ever. But beneath the surface of that dutiful composure, Oliver glimpsed something else, a flicker of deep distress, almost imperceptible, yet painfully clear to Oliver, whose foolish actions had provoked it. In that instant, Oliver comprehended with agonizing clarity the gravity of his error. This was no ordinary prank. He disrupted something far more sacred, crossing boundaries he'd ignorantly disregarded in pursuit of superficial admiration. Just steps away, an elderly man clutching a carved wooden cane watched Oliver intently, his gaze conveying profound disappointment. Beside the old man sat a small terrier, alert and gentle, its warm brown eyes reflecting an unsettling sadness as though it, too, understood the transgression. The dog leaned against its owner's leg, quietly whimpering, a sound so faint yet powerful it resonated profoundly within Oliver's chest. That small, innocent creature, unaffected by pride or ego, felt the injustice far more keenly than Oliver had imagined possible. A surge of bitter regret filled Oliver's throat, choking him further as he realized even animals recognize dignity and respect in ways he, in his youthful arrogance, had failed to grasp. Oliver's ears rang with the sharp, bitter voices around him, each word amplifying his humiliation. A voice, shrill and piercing, cried out angrily, "Have you no respect? This man serves his country." Oliver's heart plunged further, each accusation becoming a stabbing blade of guilt twisting mercilessly within his soul. He opened his mouth, hoping desperately to apologize, to say something, anything, but the words evaporated from his dry tongue, leaving him mute and defenseless. He felt vulnerable, exposed as a fraud whose facade of charisma and humor had shattered spectacularly, exposing the selfishness beneath. Behind him, his friends stood paralyzed, their phones still raised but forgotten, the jokes silenced now, replaced by confusion and growing embarrassment. Oliver turned pleadingly towards Stanley, hoping for reassurance, solidarity, anything, but Stanley's eyes were fixed uncomfortably elsewhere, deliberately avoiding Oliver's desperate gaze. Betrayal surged through Oliver's veins, raw and corrosive. He realized bitterly he was now alone in this nightmare he'd recklessly created. Karma had found him swiftly, delivering justice he never believed would reach him. All that bravado, all the hollow laughter and superficial applause had evaporated instantly, leaving behind only painful isolation. Oliver's pulse quickened as the crowd parted slightly, revealing the elderly man and his terrier approaching. Their slow, deliberate steps echoed with finality. The man halted before Oliver, his wrinkled face stern but softened with compassion, as though he saw past Oliver's folly into the frightened, confused soul beneath. The terrier stood obediently at his feet, looking up at Oliver, its eyes filled with gentle wisdom. Oliver knelt slowly, instinctively reaching a trembling hand out to the animal, seeking comfort or perhaps forgiveness from a creature incapable of deceit. The dog hesitated momentarily, then cautiously stepped forward, gently placing its paw against Oliver's palm. The simplicity of this touch, this silent act of empathy, broke something within Oliver, shattering the final remnants of pride he desperately clung to. His shoulders shook uncontrollably, tears of shame escaping despite his best efforts. Here he was, humbled profoundly by a creature who could sense genuine remorse, who recognized authenticity where humans often failed. From the edge of the crowd, another voice rose sharply. "Leave him alone. He deserves it." Oliver's shame deepened further as he realized they were defending the dog, not him. The terrier whimpered softly again, pressing its head gently against Oliver's knee. He stroked the dog's head softly, feeling the warmth, the unconditional kindness radiating through the gentle creature. In that moment, he fully grasped the painful lesson fate had chosen to impart. Actions had consequences, deeper and more profound than he'd ever considered. This creature, untouched by pride or cruelty, understood something Oliver had long forgotten, the beauty and fragility of dignity. Slowly standing, Oliver faced the elderly gentleman, attempting to form words of apology, but his throat refused cooperation, choked by remorse too deep for mere speech. Instead, the old man nodded slightly, the faintest of sympathetic smiles crossing his weathered lips, communicating understanding without absolving Oliver completely. He quietly turned away, guiding his loyal companion through the dispersing crowd, leaving Oliver alone with the heavy weight of his misdeeds. Suddenly, a sharp, official voice broke the silence, chilling Oliver's blood instantly. "You there! Stay where you are!" Two uniformed officers approached swiftly, their authoritative strides echoing sharply against the cobblestones, faces grim with uncompromising intent. Oliver's knees threatened to buckle as the gravity of the situation enveloped him. His foolish prank, intended only for fleeting amusement, now carried serious repercussions he could neither foresee nor prevent. The guard, whose silent discipline Oliver had disrupted, glanced fleetingly towards Oliver now, his expression unreadable. Yet in those eyes lingered a quiet sadness, a buried pain Oliver recognized intimately. A connection formed briefly, a silent exchange, weighted with implications Oliver could not yet fully understand but felt deeply, painfully. Oliver realized then, with crushing certainty, he had intruded upon something sacred, disrupting more than just the dignity of a guard's duty. He had disturbed something profoundly human and delicate beneath. As the stern official approached him, Oliver stood frozen, heart thundering, realizing with absolute certainty that his life had reached a critical turning point, a place from which he could never return unchanged. Every choice he'd ever made had culminated here, trapping him mercilessly in this defining moment. His pride, recklessness, and superficiality now stood before him, stripped bare, their ugly truths impossible to avoid any longer. With dread swelling in his stomach, Oliver watched as the officer raised a hand, signaling clearly that judgment had arrived, consequences inevitable. Yet even in this moment of helpless vulnerability, something stirred fiercely within Oliver's chest, a sudden, aching determination to face whatever came next with courage, humility, and accountability. Though his soul felt wounded and exposed, Oliver knew he owed at least this much to himself and especially to the innocent beings he'd unknowingly hurt along the way. His pulse quickened once more, uncertainty and fear gripping him with relentless strength, yet somewhere deep inside stirred an unfamiliar resolve, compelling him to face whatever consequence awaited, however painful. As he raised his head slowly, meeting the stern gaze of authority now looming ominously over him, one question echoed powerfully in his mind, gripping him with both fear and hope. Could redemption ever truly be possible after such an egregious mistake, or was his fate now sealed in an unforgiving moment that would define his future forever? Oliver knew only one thing was certain. Life, as he knew it, would never be the same again. Oliver Blake sat alone at his kitchen table, the soft, steady hum of Manchester traffic drifting through the half-open window, mingling seamlessly with the relentless ticking of the antique clock that hung prominently on the faded beige wall. Its pendulum swung rhythmically, marking each second like a muted heartbeat, a subtle yet persistent reminder of the inescapable march of time. Each tick seemed heavier now, each beat landing like a verdict upon Oliver's conscience, echoing relentlessly in his thoughts, compounding the emotional turmoil that already gripped him mercilessly from within. His once cheerful, lively flat now felt empty and oppressive, its walls closing in as though seeking to punish him for the reckless indiscretion that now plagued his every waking moment. Scattered across the table, in a chaotic clutter that mirrored his mind, were newspapers and printed screenshots, their sensationalist headlines starkly visible, each one piercing deeper into his battered conscience. "Shameful act at Windsor," screamed one headline, while another proclaimed with damning finality, "Manchester man disrespects Royal Guard, public demands justice." The relentless media had painted him into the portrait of a heartless villain, an image that seemed entirely alien to the carefree, confident man he believed himself to be. His chest tightened painfully, the weight of guilt pressing against him like a physical force, relentless and unyielding. He picked up the nearest newspaper, unable to resist reading once more the lines that now defined him to the world. "Cruel prankster humiliates Honorable Royal Guard. Public calls for justice." The words burned themselves into his memory, scorching into his conscience like embers branding flesh, mercilessly reinforcing the image of villainy he feared he would never shake off. Oliver let the paper slip from his fingers, sinking back heavily into the chair, overwhelmed by a wave of profound remorse. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he thought desperately, his eyes clouding with tears of frustration and shame. His phone buzzed violently on the table, vibrating noisily against the wood, startling him from his painful reverie. He hesitated, anxiety coiling sharply within him as he reached slowly, reluctantly, to glance at the screen. The device was flooded with notifications, hateful comments, scathing accusations, messages filled with disgust and disappointment. Oliver's heart clenched tightly as he read the latest venomous remark. "You deserve every bit of shame coming your way. Karma always finds people like you." Those words, sharp as glass shards, dug deeply into his consciousness, a stark reminder that actions have consequences beyond anything he had previously considered. His finger hovered uncertainly over the messages, each one more vicious than the last, their intensity a constant barrage against his fragile psyche. Yet amidst the condemnation, one message stood out distinctly, a simple yet profoundly haunting statement. What if that guard was your own father, brother, or son? Oliver felt a crushing wave of anguish sweep over him once more, his breath hitching sharply as fresh, uncontrollable sobs threatened to consume him. How had he allowed himself to become so blinded by vanity, by superficial recognition, that he'd ignored basic human decency? As if sensing his despair, a gentle nudge beneath the table startled him, pulling him momentarily away from the tormenting spiral of regret. Looking down, his weary eyes met the trusting gaze of Rufus, his aging golden retriever. The dog's fur, now streaked with gray, glistened softly beneath a beam of fading sunlight streaming through the open window. Rufus tilted his head, silently asking for reassurance, for comfort. Oliver reached down instinctively, running trembling fingers gently through Rufus' fur, comforted by the warmth and innocence radiating from his loyal companion. In that instant, Oliver's heart fractured further, realizing painfully that Rufus, innocent and blameless, could sense his anguish, bearing the silent burden of Oliver's mistake. The animal's unwavering, empathetic gaze deepened Oliver's guilt, highlighting vividly the contrast between Rufus's unconditional compassion and Oliver's careless selfishness. His throat tightened once more, tears sliding silently down his cheeks as he stroked Rufus's soft fur, whispering broken apologies meant for ears incapable of judgment or reproach. Rufus leaned into his trembling hand, offering unconditional comfort, reinforcing the harsh truth Oliver now confronted. Empathy and kindness were inherent in even the simplest creatures, and he, supposedly wiser, had lost sight of that profound truth. A sudden, forceful knock at the door shattered the fragile calm Oliver had briefly experienced, reverberating ominously through the flat. His pulse quickened, anxiety gripping him tightly as he reluctantly stood, Rufus trailing closely at his heels, sensing Oliver's dread. The floorboards creaked beneath his uncertain footsteps as he approached the door, each step heavier than the last, as if his body instinctively resisted facing whatever consequence lay beyond that wooden threshold. Slowly opening the door, Oliver's stomach plummeted. Standing sternly before him were two uniformed officers, their expressions coldly professional, eyes scrutinizing him with undisguised judgment. Behind them lingered a small crowd of neighbors, their faces etched with disbelief and disapproval, their whispers cutting through Oliver like blades. He recognized Mrs. Hammond, the gentle elderly widow from downstairs who'd once trusted him to walk her spaniel when arthritis had claimed her mobility. Her gaze, usually kind and forgiving, was now distant, saddened and questioning, leaving Oliver feeling small, stripped bare by the judgment of those he once considered friendly faces. One officer stepped forward sharply, his voice clear and authoritative. "Oliver Blake, due to recent events at Windsor Castle, we must speak with you immediately." Oliver felt his knees weaken slightly, barely able to stand beneath the crushing weight of accountability. Rufus nudged Oliver's trembling hand again, seeking comfort, his eyes wide with innocent concern. A sudden surge of protective instinct rose fiercely within Oliver, protective and pure, born from the deep bond he'd built with Rufus over long, gentle years. It was ironic and heartbreaking, Oliver thought bitterly, how clearly he understood loyalty and compassion only now, under circumstances demanding severe retribution. "May we come in?" the officer prompted firmly, the implied authority making clear it wasn't a request. Oliver nodded weakly, stepping aside, allowing them entry. As the officers brushed past him, Rufus emitted a faint whimper, sensing the turmoil now engulfing their small home. Oliver knelt instinctively beside his companion, holding him close, finding solace in the animal's warmth. He wondered bitterly how an innocent creature could so effortlessly express empathy, yet humans, himself included, struggled so profoundly. As the officers stood solemnly in the cramped living room, Oliver forced himself upright, facing them bravely despite the dread gnawing insistently at his gut. "I never meant harm," he managed weakly, desperation evident in his voice. "It was just a silly joke, a stupid mistake." His words hung heavily, pleading silently for understanding he feared he wouldn't receive. The older officer regarded him steadily, expression unmoved. "Every action has consequences, Mr. Blake." "What might seem harmless to you can deeply hurt others," he responded gravely, eyes glancing meaningfully towards Rufus, who now lay trembling quietly at Oliver's feet. Those words resonated sharply, cutting deeper into Oliver's consciousness, echoing the haunting sentiment he'd heard repeatedly now from strangers and friends alike. Consequences always catch up eventually. The officers exchanged brief whispers, their tones solemn, amplifying Oliver's apprehension, until finally the younger one turned towards Oliver, eyes filled with stern finality. "You'll need to accompany us to clarify your intentions. This situation requires immediate attention." Oliver stood numbly, nodding, sensing the inevitability he'd brought upon himself. As he reached for his coat, he glanced down at Rufus, whose loyal eyes followed his every move, a silent guardian ready to share Oliver's punishment. An unbearable pang of sorrow stabbed sharply through Oliver's chest, realizing painfully how his selfishness had placed his innocent friend in harm's way. As Oliver was led out, Rufus followed quietly behind, his eyes wide with confusion, whimpering softly. Oliver turned back, devastated, pleading softly to Mrs. Hammond standing nearby, "Please take care of Rufus." She nodded solemnly, her expression softened by sadness, compassion replacing judgment momentarily in her aged eyes. As Oliver descended the stairs, each step heavier than the last, he caught one final glimpse of Rufus watching him leave, confused and hurt. His dog's innocent confusion was the final unbearable punishment, breaking Oliver entirely. And then came the realization, sharp and terrifying, this ordeal was only beginning. He had triggered something beyond his control, something darker, more powerful, more painful than he'd ever imagined. Oliver's life had irrevocably changed, consequences waiting patiently, ready to claim their price. The question now tormented him mercilessly. What else awaited, lurking in the shadows, poised to shatter whatever fragments of normality still remained? Oliver Blake stood quietly in the hallway of his Manchester flat, his usually lively home feeling suddenly claustrophobic, oppressive even. The soft light of late afternoon streamed gently through half-drawn curtains, casting muted shadows across his features, highlighting the depth of exhaustion etched into his once youthful and optimistic face. His hair, normally styled meticulously, now lay disheveled, a reflection of the turmoil raging internally. Oliver's life, which had until recently sparkled with promise and youthful optimism, seemed to unravel at the seams with relentless, brutal speed, each unraveled thread exposing another layer of vulnerability, regret, and mounting despair. He had always believed himself invincible, buoyed by a confidence bordering arrogance. Yet now, standing alone in the chilling silence of his Manchester flat, Oliver felt only a profound and hollow emptiness where pride had once resided. On the table before him lay an opened envelope, stark white against the dark, polished wood. Even without reading it again, Oliver knew every painful word by heart. The printed words, clinical and merciless, had officially ended his career at the marketing agency he'd proudly served for nearly a decade. "Your recent conduct," the letter read, "has severely compromised our reputation, leaving us no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately." Oliver swallowed hard, bitterness rising sharply in his throat. What had started as a seemingly harmless prank, an act driven by vanity and the hunger for shallow approval, had evolved swiftly into a merciless crucible, engulfing him entirely. His reputation, once his greatest asset, now lay shattered at his feet, splinters of self-esteem scattered around him, impossible to piece together again. The irony, Oliver thought bitterly, was almost poetic. He had spent his life crafting images, selling impressions, yet now the only impression left was one of profound disgrace. Outside his window, the once comforting sounds of Manchester carried on, indifferent to his personal suffering. A dog barked somewhere below, a playful, innocent sound reminding him cruelly of his own beloved companion, Rufus, now living temporarily with Mrs. Hammond down the hallway. Oliver's heart clenched painfully as guilt overwhelmed him yet again. He missed the soft, reassuring presence of his dog, Rufus's unconditional love and innocent gaze, a reminder of everything decent he'd compromised through thoughtlessness and vanity. A sudden knock jolted Oliver from his dark contemplation. He stood slowly, hesitant, each step towards the door dragging heavily with dread. When he opened it, Oliver's breath caught sharply in his throat. Standing in the corridor, looking frail yet determined, was his elderly mother, Margaret Blake, her gentle eyes weary, yet still radiating kindness and compassion. Beside her stood Rufus, tail wagging hesitantly, as though sensing the depth of Oliver's anguish. Seeing his mother here was both comforting and torturous, her loving gaze intensifying his guilt. Without a word, she stepped forward, enveloping him in a warm, compassionate embrace that nearly undid him entirely. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to sink into her comfort, feeling like a child again, vulnerable and craving forgiveness he feared was undeserved. She guided him gently back inside, closing the door softly behind her. "Oliver," she spoke quietly, yet firmly, her voice steady with conviction despite the sadness evident within, "you've always been impulsive, driven by passion rather than caution. But this time, my dear son, your actions carry consequences deeper than you know." Oliver's throat tightened as tears threatened again, the gentle truth in her words cutting deeper than any angry reprimand could. Silently, Margaret Blake moved gracefully toward the sofa, settling quietly with dignity and composure, her presence radiating quiet strength. Rufus followed obediently, his tail wagging gently as he rested his head in her lap, eyes turned expectantly towards Oliver. Margaret stroked the golden retriever softly, her fingers caressing the fur with practiced tenderness, a silent reassurance that animals inherently understood compassion, loyalty, and love far better than humans. Oliver lowered himself slowly beside them, feeling acutely the painful sting of karma, the universe returning the hurt he'd carelessly sown, yet offering him tenderness through the same beings he'd unknowingly harmed. Margaret reached for his hand, holding it softly between hers, her touch warm yet firm. "Oliver," she spoke gently, her voice steady yet charged with maternal authority, "the world judges swiftly, unforgivingly. But redemption is always possible if sincerity guides your heart. I've seen the good inside you since you were small. Don't lose sight of that now." Oliver met his mother's gaze, seeing wisdom, compassion, and profound sadness. He felt acutely the injustice he'd committed, not merely against a stoic royal guard, but against something deeper and more sacred: dignity, empathy, and simple kindness. At that moment, Rufus placed his head softly onto Oliver's knee, eyes pleading gently yet persistently for Oliver's attention. Instinctively, Oliver stroked the dog's soft fur, feeling a quiet, comforting connection that transcended spoken apologies or empty promises. He marveled silently at Rufus's innate ability to forgive, a creature capable of unconditional love despite human failings. Animals, Oliver realized profoundly, saw truths people often ignored. He now understood that animals, innocent and pure, could sense moral corruption as surely as humans sense daylight. It pained him greatly to know Rufus, loyal and trusting, bore emotional scars from Oliver's actions, innocent collateral damage in a war he'd never meant to start. Margaret's gentle voice broke the silence again, her words soft yet powerful. "Sometimes life has a way of forcing us to confront who we've become, Oliver. You now have a choice. Face this storm honestly, or hide from accountability forever." Her words were not harsh. They simply resonated profoundly with wisdom he'd ignored for far too long. Oliver felt a profound shift within himself, a stirring of determination born of guilt, humility, and newfound clarity. His life, he'd realized bitterly, had been an exercise in ego. Now he faced the daunting task of transformation, of seeking redemption and restoring dignity where he'd stripped it away. A sudden buzzing interrupted the heavy silence, Oliver's phone vibrating sharply on the coffee table. Reluctantly, he glanced down, fear tightening sharply around his heart as he saw a name he dreaded: Stanley. Tentatively, Oliver reached for it, dreading yet knowing he could not ignore reality any longer. Stanley's text message flashed coldly on the screen, each word laden with bitterness. "I'm sorry, mate. The lads think you went too far this time. You're on your own." Oliver felt an acute stab of betrayal twisting cruelly within him. Those he'd once called friends had abandoned him in his darkest hour, leaving him alone with the painful, stark truth of his mistake. Margaret squeezed his hand reassuringly, silently reminding him he wasn't truly alone, though it felt that way intensely now. Suddenly, Rufus raised his head sharply, his ears alert, attention fixed intently on the window. Curious, Oliver turned slowly, noticing a small crowd gathering below in the street, their murmurs growing louder. He moved cautiously towards the window, heart thundering anxiously within his chest. As he peered down onto the street, his stomach twisted violently with renewed dread. Protesters stood gathered beneath his window, their placards clear, uncompromising, "Respect and dignity for those who serve," read one. Another simply stated, "Justice must prevail." Margaret stood quietly beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder, silently offering strength. Yet Oliver's pulse quickened painfully. These people represented consequences, justice, karma. He understood now with chilling clarity that actions had ripples, powerful and unstoppable, carrying repercussions far beyond his limited comprehension. He saw amongst the protesters elderly citizens holding leashes, their loyal dogs standing proudly by their sides, a silent yet powerful statement that dignity and compassion were universal, stretching beyond humanity, deeply connected to all living beings. Oliver stepped back slowly, the heavy realization pressing mercilessly upon him. He'd triggered a storm, a wave whose strength and direction he could no longer control. Turning again towards his mother and loyal Rufus, Oliver knew with profound certainty that he now faced a path strewn with bitter consequences and painful truths. As Margaret rose slowly, her eyes filled with silent determination, Oliver realized his journey towards redemption had barely begun. Something darker, more challenging awaited him, a confrontation he could neither anticipate nor avoid. His heart raced painfully, one haunting question echoing ceaselessly in his mind. Could he ever truly repair the damage he'd inflicted, or had his reckless actions sealed his fate forever? Oliver Blake stood hesitantly at the gates of Windsor Castle, feeling a wave of dread crash relentlessly against the shores of his resolve. He clutched tightly at the small envelope in his trembling hand, its carefully handwritten contents carrying words of apology he'd rewritten a dozen times, though none seemed capable of truly conveying the magnitude of his remorse. Windsor's great stone walls loomed imposingly above him, ancient sentinels watching over centuries of history, dignity, and honor. They were no longer merely tourist attractions, but intimidating reminders of his missteps, silently admonishing him for his earlier arrogance. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting long shadows across the cobblestones at Oliver's feet, shadows that appeared distorted and hauntingly accusatory. The familiar hustle and bustle of tourists had quieted, and in the fading daylight, the castle's grandeur took on an air of melancholy, as though saddened by Oliver's audacity. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, whispering softly in his ear, carrying voices from memories past, voices filled with warnings he'd stubbornly ignored. Oliver's heartbeat quickened anxiously, each pulse reverberating painfully through his veins, an urgent rhythm matching his apprehension. In his trembling hand was the letter he'd carefully composed, a heartfelt apology to Sergeant Lewis Radcliffe, the very royal guard he had humiliated. Every word had cost Oliver sleepless nights, endless rewrites, and uncountable moments of agonizing reflection. Still, he feared no words could possibly repair the damage he'd inflicted, not merely on a man's pride, but perhaps upon something deeper, something intangible, yet infinitely sacred. As Oliver waited nervously, he noticed the subtle movements around him, tourists moving quietly, sensing something heavy hanging in the air. Their faces held looks of curious recognition, whispers followed his steps, tinged with disapproval. His chest tightened as he recognized their judgment, but he accepted it silently, realizing now that this, too, was a consequence of his careless pursuit of fame. Even though the pain stung sharply, Oliver knew he deserved every bitter glance, every murmured word of reproach. At last, a guard approached silently, his footsteps echoing with a quiet authority. Oliver swallowed hard, anxiety coiling tightly within his stomach. He recognized this man, not Radcliffe, but another guard, younger yet carrying an unmistakable seriousness that demanded respect. "Sergeant Radcliffe has agreed to see you briefly," the guard announced curtly, eyes devoid of warmth. Oliver nodded mutely, gratitude and fear tangling inside him, unsure of which emotion dominated more strongly. The guard led Oliver through the quiet corridors of Windsor, their footsteps echoing solemnly against stone floors polished smooth by countless generations before. Each step felt heavier, each footfall resonating with Oliver's deepening regret. They halted abruptly at a modest wooden door, unadorned, yet radiating dignity. Oliver took a deep, trembling breath, forcing himself to gather courage, as the guard opened the door slowly, revealing the interior of a small, sparsely furnished office. Sergeant Radcliffe stood near a window, looking out across the courtyard. The late afternoon sunlight caught the man's face, illuminating lines of quiet determination, and a depth of character Oliver had overlooked entirely during his reckless prank. Radcliffe did not immediately acknowledge Oliver's presence, allowing silence to stretch uncomfortably between them. Oliver felt the pressure of that silence acutely, realizing this was Radcliffe's subtle yet powerful way of exerting control, reminding Oliver that dignity could never be taken, only temporarily obscured. Finally, Radcliffe turned slowly, his dark eyes meeting Oliver's uncertain gaze with piercing intensity. Oliver felt exposed under that scrutiny, stripped of any lingering pretense. "I'm grateful for your willingness to see me," Oliver managed weakly, his voice trembling, betraying his emotional turmoil. Radcliffe's expression remained impassive, yet Oliver saw something beneath that controlled exterior, a flicker of deep, unspoken pain that mirrored Oliver's own remorseful suffering. Radcliffe stepped forward deliberately, his posture rigid yet graceful, commanding attention effortlessly. "Mr. Blake," he began in a voice that resonated quietly, profoundly authoritative, "your actions, though perhaps trivial to you, struck far deeper than you could possibly realize." Oliver winced visibly, feeling each word slice deeply, painfully exposing raw nerves of guilt within him. "Do you understand," Radcliffe continued softly yet powerfully, "what this uniform truly represents?" Oliver's throat tightened painfully, words trapped in a net of shame. Radcliffe stepped closer, eyes never leaving Oliver's face. "It represents honor, duty, and sacrifice," he said firmly, voice unwavering despite evident emotion trembling beneath the surface. "But your actions," he paused meaningfully, ridiculed not just me, but every man and woman who ever stood silently, proudly, bearing that honor." The unbearable weight of Radcliffe's words crushed Oliver's heart mercilessly. Tears burned hotly behind his eyes, a potent mixture of shame, humility, and grief overwhelming him. He finally spoke, voice thick with emotion. "I was arrogant and thoughtless. I'm profoundly sorry, far more sorry than words alone can express." Radcliffe studied Oliver quietly, the silence stretching, dense and painful. Finally he spoke, his tone softer, tinged now with something closer to sadness than anger. "Your apology is sincere, I see that. But sincerity alone cannot undo the consequences. Trust, dignity, respect, these things cannot easily be restored." He paused, eyes briefly glancing away, a fleeting expression of sorrow Oliver noticed keenly. Then Radcliffe's eyes flickered towards a small framed photograph on the desk. Following his gaze, Oliver saw a young man in military uniform, smiling brightly, full of youthful optimism. Radcliffe gently picked up the picture, cradling it tenderly, his voice barely audible. "My brother, Samuel. He died years ago, another victim of a senseless prank gone wrong. I lost him because someone else, like you, valued a moment's amusement over compassion and respect." Oliver felt as though the floor beneath him had vanished, plunging him into icy waters of realization. The karmic blow was devastating, cruelly ironic, yet undeniably just. Radcliffe placed the photograph gently back onto the desk, his eyes glistening now with quiet grief. "Your actions reopened wounds that never truly healed. You thought you targeted just me, but in truth, you disturbed memories of loss, of family, of love." Oliver's tears finally escaped, tracing silent paths down his pale cheeks. "I didn't know," he choked out, broken by genuine sorrow. "Please believe me, I never intended to cause such pain." Radcliffe sighed deeply, shaking his head slightly, his voice gentler yet heavy with resigned wisdom. "Intentions, Oliver, rarely matter once damage is done. But perhaps through your pain now, you might truly understand that empathy, dignity, and compassion must always guide our actions." Oliver nodded weakly, unable to speak, overwhelmed completely by the magnitude of his mistake. His mind flashed painfully to Rufus, his loyal companion, whose unconditional love had never wavered despite Oliver's failings. Animals instinctively understood empathy and dignity. How had he, supposedly wiser, failed so profoundly? Radcliffe stepped back slightly, his voice regaining formal strength, a subtle yet unmistakable distance re-emerging. "You must leave now, Mr. Blake. Your apology is accepted, though my forgiveness, true forgiveness, must still be earned." Oliver stepped slowly backwards, the weight of Radcliffe's words pressing painfully upon him. He turned, his feet dragging as he left the room silently, realizing profoundly that his journey towards redemption had barely begun. As the door closed behind him, Oliver felt the stark truth crashing mercilessly down upon him. This was not an ending, but a challenging new beginning, a path fraught with pain, humility, and difficult lessons. Walking slowly away, each step heavier, Oliver's heart filled with uncertainty, a powerful question tormenting him endlessly. Would he ever find true redemption, or had his careless actions forever locked him in an unforgiving cycle of consequence? The truth awaited patiently ahead, cloaked in shadows he must now bravely face. Oliver Blake stood alone in the quiet dimness of a modest local library, tucked discreetly away in a corner of Windsor, far from the grandeur of the castle and the scrutiny of its tourists. The late afternoon sun filtered softly through stained glass windows, casting muted hues of amber, blue, and crimson across the worn wooden shelves lined with countless books. A heavy scent of aged paper and polished oak lingered comfortingly in the air, wrapping Oliver momentarily in the promise of refuge, a brief sanctuary from the painful reality that still stalked his every thought and step. Yet the peace was fragile, easily shattered. As Oliver's eyes scanned nervously across a particular shelf, his fingers brushing hesitantly along the spines of old newspapers and historical archives. His heart quickened anxiously with each passing headline, each article from the past an invisible yet tangible thread connecting him to a hidden truth that had haunted him since his conversation with Sergeant Radcliffe. Oliver's breathing grew shallow, his pulse accelerating, as he pulled gently at a dusty newspaper dated 15 years prior, his hands trembling slightly. He carried the fragile paper carefully to a secluded reading table near the window, lowering himself slowly into the chair. As Oliver opened the archive carefully, his eyes were instantly drawn to a photograph, grainy and faded yet painfully vivid, a young man's face staring back at him, familiar eyes and features that were unmistakably those of Sergeant Radcliffe, albeit younger, softer, less burdened by time. Beside him stood a younger boy, perhaps 15 or 16, smiling warmly, innocence radiating from his youthful features. The caption read coldly beneath, "Local family mourns tragic loss. Teenager victim of cruel prank gone horribly wrong." Oliver's heart froze momentarily, a devastating chill gripping him. He felt as though he'd plunged headfirst into icy waters, the harsh, merciless shock numbing every nerve within him. The painful irony struck him with profound clarity, leaving him breathless with sorrow. His eyes scanned the article frantically, desperation mounting with each harrowing word he read, every sentence stabbing deeply into his conscience. The article detailed how Samuel Radcliffe, younger brother of Lewis Radcliffe, had tragically died after being targeted by a prank eerily similar to the one Oliver had foolishly performed at Windsor Castle. The words were clinical, yet devastatingly cruel, narrating how Samuel, humiliated and distraught by the pranksters, had panicked and fled blindly into traffic, struck fatally by a speeding vehicle. Oliver felt sick, nauseated by the sheer horror unfolding painfully before him. His chest ached fiercely, shame and remorse constricting his heart as the undeniable reality of his careless cruelty hit him with savage precision. Karma, in its most devastatingly ironic form, was teaching him a lesson he feared he'd never recover from. Oliver's hands shook violently, causing the brittle newspaper to rustle harshly in the stillness, echoing like thunder in his ears. Tears welled relentlessly, blurring the black and white photograph that accompanied the painful article. Samuel's innocent smile mocked him cruelly from the page. Oliver could barely comprehend how such purity, such innocence, had been extinguished by careless cruelty so disturbingly akin to his own. Karma had indeed returned with ruthless precision, revealing truths he could not bear but could no longer deny. He closed his eyes briefly, leaning heavily back into the chair, emotions overwhelming him entirely. He thought bitterly of Rufus, his loyal companion, who had suffered quietly yet profoundly as a result of Oliver's recklessness. Oliver's heart ached at the realization that innocent beings, animals and humans alike, bore the scars of thoughtless acts committed by those who never paused to consider their consequences. Just as Oliver began sinking deeper into self-reproach, the sound of footsteps approaching quietly broke the oppressive silence. He turned his head slightly, startled to find a gentle-faced librarian standing cautiously at his side, an elderly woman whose kind, wise eyes softened instantly at the sight of his distress. Her delicate, wrinkled hands rested compassionately upon Oliver's shoulder, conveying an unspoken comfort that he had unknowingly sought. "You knew the Radcliffe family?" she asked softly, her voice soothing yet tinged with sadness. Oliver hesitated, shame burning fiercely in his cheeks. Slowly, he nodded, unable to voice the painful truth. "Samuel Radcliffe was a kind, gentle boy," she continued softly, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "His brother Lewis never quite recovered from losing him. I remember how close they were, inseparable. Oliver's heart twisted painfully with remorse, her gentle words opening old wounds deeper, forcing him to confront how deeply he'd underestimated the weight of his actions. The librarian's gaze drifted thoughtfully out the window, lingering upon an elderly man seated quietly on a park bench nearby. Beside him sat a faithful Labrador, its gentle eyes alert, patiently watching the world pass by. The dog raised its head slightly, seemingly sensing Oliver's turmoil even from a distance, its calm, reassuring presence another stark reminder of the empathy Oliver had recklessly ignored in his own life. The tragedy changed Lewis forever, the librarian continued quietly, her voice reflective yet powerful. He dedicated his life to honoring his brother's memory. Every day he served silently, proudly, holding on to dignity that others once stole from Samuel. Oliver felt a crushing weight settle once more upon his heart, the karmic justice bitter, yet undeniably just, punishing him profoundly, yet offering him a chance to learn humility, empathy, and perhaps eventually redemption. Oliver stood unsteadily, thanking the librarian softly before stepping into the gathering dusk outside. Approaching the elderly man on the bench, Oliver felt his pulse quicken anxiously again, a sense of destiny tugging insistently at him. The Labrador raised its head, tail wagging gently, its trusting gaze meeting Oliver's uncertain eyes, silently reminding him of the inherent goodness that resided quietly within innocent souls, human or animal. It pained him deeply, this reminder of simple virtues he'd neglected so thoughtlessly. The elderly man smiled gently, sensing Oliver's hesitancy, nodding towards the Labrador. "Animals always know, young man," he murmured softly, wisdom radiating from his steady gaze. "They sense sincerity, kindness, and sorrow. Perhaps, through them, we might learn empathy ourselves." Oliver knelt carefully, feeling a sudden, inexplicable connection as he gently stroked the dog's fur, comforted by its silent acceptance. He looked again towards Windsor Castle, its silhouette dominating the skyline, reminding him of Sergeant Radcliffe, Samuel, and the dignity he'd recklessly disregarded. Oliver now understood profoundly that life was a complex tapestry, woven intricately by the threads of actions and their inevitable consequences, both visible and invisible. His reckless prank had unraveled threads he could never fully repair, but perhaps, he thought cautiously, there remained threads he could still mend. The librarian, observing quietly, placed a gentle hand reassuringly on Oliver's shoulder again, speaking softly. "Sometimes we must confront the pain we've caused to truly understand ourselves. Perhaps this tragedy can yet bring meaning, forgiveness, even hope." Oliver felt humbled profoundly by her wisdom, knowing instinctively this moment marked the beginning of a challenging journey, one he could no longer avoid. As the sun dipped lower, casting the city into twilight shadows, Oliver Blake realized he stood upon a crossroads, burdened with profound guilt yet guided gently by newfound understanding. The truths he'd uncovered today haunted and healed simultaneously, offering a painful yet necessary revelation. Empathy, respect, and compassion were far more powerful than vanity or fame. Oliver turned again towards Windsor, his heart heavy yet determined. A single, haunting question remained unanswered. Could he ever truly earn Sergeant Radcliffe's forgiveness, or had his thoughtlessness set into motion consequences that would define his life forever? The truth awaited him silently, ready to challenge him beyond anything he had ever imagined. Oliver Blake stepped quietly into the dimly lit community hall on the outskirts of Manchester, feeling his heartbeat quicken with a nervous intensity he could scarcely control. The low ceiling, softly illuminated by aged, yellowing lights, cast comforting yet melancholy shadows across the worn wooden floorboards. His every cautious step echoed faintly, drawing attention despite his desperate desire for anonymity. The room buzzed softly with gentle murmurs and whispered conversations, yet all eyes subtly flickered towards him, eyes filled not with curiosity or intrigue, but with cautious skepticism, an unmistakable wariness born from his now infamous mistake. He clutched a thin stack of papers tightly in his trembling hands, the words upon them carefully crafted, yet painfully insufficient to truly communicate the profound change he'd begun experiencing deep within his soul. Oliver felt exposed, vulnerable. His presence, once welcomed with laughter and admiration, was now perceived as an intrusion, a jarring reminder of his own irresponsibility. Yet he knew that facing this moment was necessary, a vital step toward redemption, toward reclaiming a sense of self-respect he'd recklessly abandoned. Slowly, Oliver walked towards a makeshift podium placed humbly at the front of the hall, his footsteps echoing gently across the silence that had descended, each step heavier than the last. Before him sat an audience filled primarily with older men and women, their eyes attentive yet critical, each gaze feeling like a silent judgment of his sincerity. Many were accompanied by faithful canine companions who sat quietly at their feet, their presence serving as both comfort and stark reminder, a testament to loyalty and empathy, virtues he'd previously failed to fully appreciate. As Oliver reached the podium, he hesitated, looking down at the speech he had carefully rehearsed. But as he stood there, words suddenly failed him, abandoning him to face the crowd alone, armed only with honesty and vulnerability. Slowly raising his eyes, Oliver met the steady gaze of an elderly woman seated prominently in the front row, her aged hand gently stroking a golden retriever lying peacefully beside her. Her expression was stern yet compassionate, eyes glistening softly with the wisdom of countless years. Oliver felt immediately humbled by her presence, reminded sharply of how deeply his actions had wounded others, innocent people whose dignity he'd unknowingly compromised. Taking a deep breath, he began softly, his voice carrying clearly, yet gently across the room. "My name is Oliver Blake," he said, voice wavering slightly, yet determined. "Most of you already know my name, not because of any kindness or good deed, but due to a shameful, selfish act that I can never undo." His voice faltered momentarily, yet he pushed forward, sincerity evident in every trembling word. "I am here not seeking forgiveness. Forgiveness must be earned, and perhaps I've forfeited my right to ask for it, but I am here because I've realized profoundly the harm I've caused. Not just to Sergeant Radcliffe, who I treated with unthinkable disrespect, but to something deeper, something sacred that binds us all, empathy, kindness, and dignity." Oliver paused, tears welling silently in his eyes, sincerity radiating powerfully in every word. The room grew quieter, yet the tension slowly softened, replaced subtly by curiosity and guarded compassion. His voice strengthened slightly as he continued, words flowing directly from his wounded heart. "I once thought pranks and jokes were harmless, just moments of entertainment. But I've come to realize how devastatingly wrong that was. My actions shattered trust, reopened wounds long buried, and worse, disrespected the quiet, humble dignity of those who serve others." He glanced towards the elderly woman again, noticing the gentle comfort she provided her faithful companion. Oliver's heart tightened painfully with realization. Animals understood loyalty and compassion effortlessly, far better than he'd allowed himself to. How had he forgotten such simple truths? How had he become so blinded by superficial approval that he'd ignored fundamental decency? Oliver set his papers down, abandoning the scripted speech entirely. "When I learned about Sergeant Radcliffe's brother Samuel, who tragically lost his life in circumstances horribly similar to my own actions, my heart broke, not only for the senseless loss, but for my own blindness and arrogance. I stand here now because I want nothing more than to honor Samuel's memory and to restore at least a fraction of the dignity I selfishly took away." The room was utterly silent now, each person absorbed, feeling the depth of Oliver's remorse. Many listeners had tears in their eyes, moved deeply by his raw vulnerability. Oliver continued softly yet passionately. "Today, I promise to dedicate myself to raising awareness of the true cost of careless actions, actions I once thought innocent. I promise to use every ounce of energy, every remaining day of my life, to remind people that empathy, dignity, and respect are precious gifts never to be taken lightly." Suddenly, a quiet sound startled Oliver, a gentle whimper from the golden retriever seated near the elderly woman. Oliver glanced down, noticing the animal's soft brown eyes gazing intently at him, radiating silent, unconditional acceptance. Oliver knelt instinctively, extending a trembling hand gently towards the dog. Without hesitation, the retriever rose slowly, padding carefully forward, placing its head reassuringly in Oliver's palm, eyes never leaving his. Oliver felt overwhelmed, tears streaming unchecked down his cheeks as the dog's silent compassion touched him deeply, profoundly. The elderly woman stood slowly, her eyes softened with quiet understanding. "Animals always know Mr. Blake," she spoke gently yet powerfully, her voice carrying wisdom that resonated deeply within Oliver. "They sense sincerity, remorse, and genuine kindness. Perhaps through their eyes, we can all rediscover compassion we've forgotten." Oliver nodded silently, humbled profoundly by her gentle yet firm words. He understood now, clearer than ever, the magnitude of his responsibility to redeem, to restore, to honor. The crowd watched quietly, emotions charged powerfully throughout the room, each person feeling deeply Oliver's sincerity, his genuine remorse. As Oliver rose slowly, the elderly woman reached gently for his hand, holding it briefly. "You have a difficult path ahead, Oliver," she said softly, her voice gentle yet unwavering. "But remember, every step taken in humility and sincerity is a step closer to forgiveness." Oliver nodded solemnly, feeling both the burden and opportunity her words presented. The retriever, returning loyally to her side, gazed warmly at Oliver once more, a silent promise of forgiveness possible through sincere effort. As the gathering slowly dispersed, Oliver felt a sense of purpose replacing his fear, determination born from profound understanding, humility, and genuine empathy. Yet he knew that words alone were insufficient. Actions would define his sincerity, his redemption. Outside, in the soft twilight glow, Oliver stood quietly, reflecting deeply on the path ahead. Suddenly, he noticed a familiar figure standing alone across the street, Sergeant Radcliffe, silently observing Oliver with an unreadable expression. Their eyes met briefly, a silent, powerful exchange passing between them. Radcliffe nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, before turning quietly away, leaving Oliver wondering. Had he finally begun to bridge the chasm he himself created, or had he merely reached the first step on a long, uncertain road toward true forgiveness? Oliver's heart raced anxiously, determination mixing intensely with lingering doubt. His journey had barely begun, yet the question haunted him relentlessly. Would his sincerity truly be enough to heal wounds so deeply inflicted, or had the consequences of his thoughtless actions forever reshaped his destiny? The answer lay ahead, hidden in shadows he must bravely confront, shadows concealing truths Oliver feared yet desperately needed to discover. Oliver Blake stood quietly at the edge of Windsor's Alexandra Gardens, the soft hues of early evening descending gently upon the scene around him. Trees swayed softly in the cool autumn breeze, their leaves rustling like distant whispers, subtle reminders of all the unseen forces guiding his journey. The sky above him, painted with streaks of purple, gold, and burnt orange, seemed to mirror the emotional turmoil within his chest, where hope and dread collided relentlessly. Each heartbeat resonated through him with a painful awareness of his past mistakes and the uncertain path of redemption he now faced. Beside Oliver stood Sergeant Lewis Radcliffe, a presence that radiated dignity even in the most casual of surroundings. Radcliffe wore civilian clothing now, a simple dark coat over muted colors, but his military bearing remained unmistakably intact, a quiet, authoritative dignity earned from years of discipline, sacrifice, and silent grief. Neither man spoke initially, each contemplating privately the weight of the fragile, unlikely alliance they were now attempting to forge. Oliver's throat tightened anxiously. This meeting symbolized both his greatest hope and deepest fear, that his attempts at redemption could either succeed or unravel further into painful humiliation. Around them, the gardens buzzed softly with life. Families walked slowly, couples lingered in gentle conversation, and elderly residents strolled leisurely, many accompanied by dogs whose gentle, faithful companionship provided quiet, unconditional reassurance. Oliver watched one elderly gentleman passing slowly, accompanied by a border collie whose intelligent eyes seemed to read Oliver's uncertainty from afar. The animal's quiet, watchful gaze tugged sharply at Oliver's conscience. Animals always seemed instinctively aware of sincerity, compassion, and remorse. Their purity illuminated painfully Oliver's former blindness to these virtues. Radcliffe finally turned to Oliver, breaking the silence, gently yet firmly. His voice, steady and calm, carried unmistakable weight, speaking directly to Oliver's heart as much as his ears. "Oliver, I agree to meet with you here because I see that your remorse is genuine. But sincerity alone won't restore what's been lost. Our alliance, however fragile, demands more than mere words. It demands actions, real, meaningful actions." Oliver nodded slowly, absorbing the full weight of Radcliffe's words. "I understand," he replied quietly, his voice trembling slightly with sincerity. "I'm here to prove exactly that. Whatever you need from me, whatever is necessary, I'm ready to do it." Radcliffe studied him closely, eyes searching deeply, evaluating Oliver's sincerity. "Then follow me," Radcliffe said simply, leading Oliver down a winding path deeper into the garden, where shadows grew longer, mingling with the fading daylight. Soon, Oliver found himself standing before a small gathering near an old oak tree, beneath which stood a modest bronze memorial. Its surface, weathered gently by time, bore the names of local individuals lost in tragic incidents. At the center, freshly cleaned and maintained with respectful care, Oliver read the name clearly etched: Samuel Radcliffe. His heart seized painfully, recognizing instantly the profound significance of this memorial, a lasting testament to the brother Radcliffe had loved and lost, tragically taken by the cruelty Oliver himself had mirrored in thoughtlessness. Radcliffe knelt slowly beside the memorial, his hand resting gently upon the bronze surface, eyes filled with quiet sorrow that pierced Oliver's heart deeply. Oliver watched silently, feeling profoundly humbled by the dignity and strength Radcliffe demonstrated even in vulnerability. He stepped cautiously forward, kneeling carefully beside Radcliffe, his heart pounding fiercely with emotion. Oliver placed his trembling hand lightly beside Radcliffe's, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingertips, the solid reality of loss made painfully tangible. For a moment, neither spoke, allowing silence to envelop them, a silence heavy with remorse, respect, and shared grief. Oliver finally broke the silence, his voice barely audible, thick with emotion. "I can't change the past, Lewis, but I promise to dedicate every effort to honor Samuel's memory. Your brother will never be forgotten, I swear it." Radcliffe turned slowly to Oliver, eyes softening slightly with gratitude mixed deeply with sorrow. Samuel believed strongly in kindness and dignity. Perhaps through you, Oliver, his legacy might finally heal the wounds he left behind. Oliver felt tears sting hotly behind his eyes, overwhelmed by Radcliffe's quiet, cautious faith in him, faith Oliver feared he hadn't yet earned. Yet he understood clearly now, more profoundly than ever, the immense responsibility resting upon him to make amends, to honor Samuel's memory by inspiring others toward kindness and dignity, virtues he himself had carelessly discarded. As darkness gently descended around them, Radcliffe stood slowly, his voice stronger now, resolved and steady. "Come," he said quietly, leading Oliver further along the path toward a small gathering in a softly illuminated pavilion nearby. Oliver's pulse quickened anxiously, unsure of what awaited, yet determined to follow through with whatever test Radcliffe set forth. Entering the pavilion, Oliver noticed several older residents seated quietly, accompanied by their loyal dogs, animals who gazed upon Oliver with trusting eyes, sensing instantly the sincerity or falsity of his intent. Radcliffe addressed the group quietly yet authoritatively, his words measured and powerful. "Everyone, this is Oliver Blake, the young man responsible for the incident you've all heard about." Oliver felt a wave of humiliation threaten to drown him once more, yet he stood tall, accepting whatever judgment awaited. An elderly man rose carefully, steadying himself against a wooden cane, speaking with gentle authority. "Mr. Blake, we are here because Lewis believes in your sincerity. We want to trust that belief. But trust, like forgiveness, must be earned." Oliver nodded solemnly, feeling both humbled and burdened by the truth, spoken plainly, yet compassionately. Radcliffe stepped forward again, speaking firmly, yet kindly. "Oliver has volunteered to dedicate himself to educating the community, especially young people, about dignity, compassion, and the devastating consequences of cruelty. He will work alongside us, honoring Samuel's memory, to ensure others avoid his tragic fate." Oliver's heart quickened anxiously, realizing fully now the commitment Radcliffe demanded. Yet he accepted without hesitation, feeling strongly that this path, though challenging, offered the redemption he desperately sought. An elderly woman rose slowly, her weathered face gentle yet wise. Beside her stood a gray-haired border collie, calm and attentive. She spoke softly yet powerfully. "I lost my grandson to cruelty too," she confessed quietly. "He was kind, just like Samuel. Your actions reopened old wounds, but your courage in facing them today shows that perhaps even wounds can heal." Oliver knelt slowly, reaching gently towards the collie, whose trusting eyes welcomed him warmly. The dog placed its paw softly upon Oliver's hand, a silent promise of forgiveness, hope, and renewal. Oliver felt profoundly moved, realizing that animals instinctively forgave, recognizing sincerity without words. Their purity and dignity shamed him even further, reinforcing how crucial his journey of redemption truly was. Radcliffe watched Oliver quietly, approval faint yet evident in his thoughtful gaze. The older residents nodded gently, cautiously accepting Oliver's sincerity, ready to give him the chance to prove himself worthy. Oliver turned again to Radcliffe, speaking softly yet resolutely. "I won't disappoint you, Lewis. I'll honor Samuel and everything he stood for. I promise." Radcliffe nodded solemnly, his voice filled now with quiet strength. "Prove it through your actions, Oliver. Words alone are easily forgotten, but sincerity, humility, and compassion resonate forever." As Oliver stepped slowly from the pavilion, his heart filled with both hope and trepidation, the path towards redemption clearer, yet still challenging. The gentle gaze of the border collie lingered warmly in his memory, a silent guardian reminding Oliver that forgiveness was always possible, provided sincerity guided every step. Yet as Oliver left Alexandra Gardens, heading towards the uncertain future awaiting him, a sudden shadow crossed his path, a figure watching him silently from the gathering darkness. The stranger stepped forward slowly, an unreadable expression clouding his face, his presence unexpected, troubling. Oliver's pulse quickened sharply, a new sense of foreboding overtaking him, the fragile peace he'd briefly found shattered instantly by fear. Who was this man? What threat or hope did he represent? As Oliver paused anxiously beneath the shadowy trees, heart racing, uncertainty consumed him. The stranger's presence hinted at truths he had not yet uncovered, truths that might either cement his redemption or unravel everything he'd painstakingly built thus far. Oliver's path remained fraught with peril, consequences waiting patiently, ready to challenge his sincerity to the core. The next steps of his journey would soon demand courage and honesty greater than Oliver ever imagined possible. Oliver Blake stood nervously in the softly illuminated town hall of Windsor, his breath shallow and uneven, the rhythm of his heartbeat erratic beneath the neatly ironed shirt he'd chosen carefully for this evening. The great, vaulted ceiling soared high above, adorned with intricate plasterwork that spoke silently of history and heritage, qualities Oliver felt profoundly disconnected from. The room, filled with murmuring voices and expectant glances, pressed upon him with the subtle weight of judgment, curiosity, and perhaps something even more daunting, expectation. He felt each gaze upon him, a piercing scrutiny he'd grown painfully accustomed to since that fateful prank had altered the trajectory of his life so drastically. Sergeant Lewis Radcliffe stood calmly by his side, a silent pillar of strength and authority. His presence brought a measure of comfort, yet simultaneously heightened Oliver's anxiety. Tonight, their unlikely alliance would be put to the ultimate test, a public address, their first joint appearance aimed at spreading awareness about respect and empathy, the delicate virtues Oliver had so recklessly trampled upon in the pursuit of fleeting popularity. Yet the genuine transformation Oliver had worked tirelessly to achieve was now dangerously close to unraveling in front of an unforgiving audience. Across from them, seated prominently near the front, a stern-faced man Oliver recognized immediately as William Pritchard, a prominent figure in the local community known for his outspoken views, sat quietly, his penetrating eyes narrowed with suspicion. Beside Pritchard, a large, dignified Labrador sat patiently, his head resting loyally upon his owner's lap. Oliver felt deeply unsettled under that dog's unwavering, gentle stare. Animals always understood sincerity instinctively, and Oliver knew if he faltered here, if his sincerity failed even slightly, the dog would sense it instantly, exposing his redemption as hollow. Oliver glanced nervously towards Radcliffe, seeking silent reassurance. Radcliffe gave a barely perceptible nod, his steady expression reminding Oliver that true redemption required courage and vulnerability, no matter how harshly judgment awaited. Gathering his remaining strength, Oliver stepped cautiously forward, his voice trembling slightly yet filled with genuine conviction as he addressed the gathering crowd. "I stand before you tonight not to excuse my behavior, but to acknowledge openly how deeply I regret my actions. What began as a foolish prank, something I misguidedly believed harmless, has led me down a path I never anticipated, a path of painful yet necessary growth." Oliver paused, feeling a tightening in his throat, yet determined to speak openly, courageously. "The pain I inflicted upon Sergeant Radcliffe, upon this community, upon innocent lives, I now carry within me, a constant reminder of how recklessness destroys trust and dignity." The hall remained painfully silent, the crowd absorbing Oliver's every word, expressions uncertain, yet subtly softening. Oliver continued quietly, yet passionately, his eyes briefly finding the elderly residents seated throughout the hall, accompanied by their gentle, faithful canine companions, animals whose pure, unconditional trust shamed Oliver deeply, reminding him of how innocence and sincerity could sense moral failings humans often overlooked. Suddenly, William Pritchard rose sharply from his seat, his voice cutting harshly across Oliver's heartfelt speech. "Enough of these empty words, Mr. Blake." Pritchard snapped, his voice echoing through the hall, dripping with cold disdain. "You think a few apologies erase the humiliation you caused? Sergeant Radcliffe deserves better. This community deserves better than insincere redemption." Oliver felt instantly deflated, shame burning fiercely within him, yet he forced himself to meet Pritchard's accusatory stare directly, courageously holding firm. "I understand your anger, Mr. Pritchard," Oliver replied quietly yet firmly, voice steady despite his pounding heart. "But my remorse is genuine. My only desire is to honor those I've hurt by ensuring no one else repeats my mistakes." Pritchard scoffed loudly, stepping aggressively forward, challenging Oliver's sincerity openly. "And yet you expect forgiveness simply because you say you're sorry? Actions, Mr. Blake, define sincerity, not mere words." The tension within the hall escalated dramatically, whispers rippling anxiously throughout the crowd. Oliver felt helplessly exposed, his vulnerability painfully raw before the public eye. Yet before he could reply, Sergeant Radcliffe stepped quietly forward, standing firmly beside Oliver, his voice calm yet authoritative. "Mr. Pritchard," Radcliffe began gently, yet with unmistakable strength, "Oliver has shown me, privately, more sincerity and humility than many men I've met over decades of service. He acknowledges the harm he caused, not with empty gestures, but with genuine effort and painful honesty." Pritchard hesitated briefly, clearly surprised by Radcliffe's support. Yet his expression remained stern, eyes coldly skeptical. "You forgive him easily, Sergeant, but what about your brother Samuel? Has his memory faded so completely that this boy's cheap apologies are enough?" Radcliffe's jaw tightened slightly, the brief flicker of pain in his eyes undeniable. Oliver felt guilt surge again, powerful and unrelenting. Yet Radcliffe stood resolute, his voice unwavering. "No, forgiveness comes lightly," Radcliffe said firmly, eyes meeting Oliver's briefly, filled now with quiet trust. "But I have seen in Oliver a genuine willingness to confront his wrongdoing openly. My brother Samuel's death taught me a painful lesson, that forgiveness is the hardest, yet most necessary, act we must eventually face." A gentle murmur rippled through the room, Radcliffe's words resonating deeply. Yet Pritchard remained unconvinced, turning coldly toward the audience, seeking allies in his skepticism. Words come easy. Action and character, however, are harder to prove. "Do you truly believe Oliver Blake's sincerity outweighs the damage he's done?" Suddenly, softly from the back of the hall, a gentle voice spoke clearly, unwaveringly. Oliver turned sharply, recognizing Margaret Blake, his elderly mother, frail yet standing proudly, dignity radiating from her gentle, wise presence. Beside her sat Rufus, Oliver's beloved retriever, eyes steady and loyal. Margaret Blake stepped forward slowly, addressing Pritchard directly yet gently, wisdom resonating powerfully in her aged voice. "My son has made mistakes, deep, painful mistakes," Margaret acknowledged softly yet resolutely. "But I've watched him suffer profoundly, confronting truths he once avoided. Redemption, Mr. Pritchard, begins with remorse, humility, and the courage to face consequences directly. Oliver has embraced this path, despite the pain." Margaret gently placed her hand upon Rufus, whose trusting eyes gazed warmly at Oliver, silently reaffirming her words. Oliver felt profoundly humbled by his mother's defense, her belief fueling new determination within him. Murmurs rippled softly, sentiment in the room shifting subtly towards compassion. Pritchard, sensing the shift, stepped back hesitantly, his harshness wavering momentarily. Radcliffe took advantage of this silence, speaking firmly, yet gently. "Oliver's path to redemption will indeed require action, consistency, and commitment. But it begins tonight, here in honesty and humility." Oliver nodded gratefully, feeling profoundly humbled, yet determined to earn this cautious faith in him. Margaret smiled gently, her quiet reassurance offering strength Oliver desperately needed. As the hall gradually emptied, Oliver noticed an elderly man approaching slowly, accompanied by a gentle-eyed Labrador whose presence radiated quiet understanding. The man placed a gentle hand upon Oliver's shoulder, speaking softly yet profoundly. "True forgiveness lies in sincerity," he said warmly, eyes filled with compassionate wisdom. "Do not fear judgment. Let sincerity guide your actions, and redemption will follow." Oliver nodded solemnly, absorbing deeply the man's words. Yet as he stepped quietly outside, heart lighter yet cautious, a shadow lingered again across the street, someone watching silently from the shadows, their presence unsettling. A shiver traced Oliver's spine, uncertainty returning sharply, mingled now with fresh anxiety. Who was watching him silently from afar, waiting patiently for a moment of vulnerability? Oliver's newfound hope trembled uncertainly beneath a growing sense of foreboding. What new challenge awaited him just beyond sight, hidden within shadows he must bravely face? The answer lay ahead, both terrifying and necessary, ready to test Oliver's sincerity once more. Oliver Blake stood quietly beside Sergeant Lewis Radcliffe on the gently sloping green fields just outside Windsor, beneath skies that had turned gray and somber, as though nature itself reflected the emotional heaviness of this decisive moment. The cool wind blew softly, rippling through the tall grass and rustling leaves that whispered gently in the background, offering an almost musical accompaniment to Oliver's racing thoughts. It had been months since his humiliating misjudgment had torn through his life, altering the very fabric of his existence, but today would test everything he had painstakingly tried to mend. The vast green expanse of Windsor's countryside stretched out peacefully before them, gently rolling hills dotted with grazing sheep, their soft bleating drifting on the breeze, a simple sound, calming yet strangely poignant, reminding Oliver of innocence he once carelessly trampled upon. Oliver breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the fresh countryside air, yet feeling the tension still coiled tightly within him. Beside him, Radcliffe stood with composed dignity, gaze steady yet carrying quiet intensity that Oliver had grown to deeply respect. Gathered just ahead, a modest crowd awaited them patiently, a community that had initially condemned Oliver, only recently softening under the undeniable sincerity of his actions. But today was different. Today they were here not merely to judge, but to witness whether Oliver's remorse and redemption would endure when confronted with the painful reality of accountability. Among the crowd stood familiar faces, stern yet curious, waiting expectantly, among them William Pritchard, whose skepticism had once nearly crushed Oliver's fragile progress. His presence served as a sharp reminder that forgiveness was neither assured nor given lightly. Beside Pritchard sat Margaret Blake, Oliver's elderly mother, her serene presence radiating quiet strength. At her side, Rufus, Oliver's faithful retriever, sat calmly, his gentle eyes watchful yet trusting. The sight of Rufus brought both comfort and a painful reminder of Oliver's previous selfishness. Innocent souls, human and animal alike, had suffered due to his careless actions. Oliver's throat tightened slightly as he considered this poignant truth again, the pain of past mistakes still sharp and vivid. Radcliffe turned gently towards Oliver, his voice low and measured, carefully chosen words meant for Oliver alone. "Remember, Oliver, today isn't about convincing them. It's about showing your sincerity to yourself. Honor your journey, your humility, and your commitment to the dignity you've learned to value." Oliver nodded solemnly, deeply absorbing Radcliffe's wisdom. He stepped forward slowly, his pulse quickening as all eyes turned expectantly towards him. The weight of their scrutiny pressed upon him, but this time it carried not merely judgment but hope, the hope that Oliver's journey of redemption could truly lead others toward empathy and understanding. "Thank you all for coming today," Oliver began gently, his voice steady yet vulnerable. "I'm here because I've understood profoundly the true price of my recklessness, the devastating consequences when respect and dignity are carelessly dismissed." His voice trembled slightly, yet the truth in his words resonated clearly. A ripple of murmured agreement passed through the crowd, encouraging Oliver. "When I first met Sergeant Radcliffe, I foolishly saw him as a mere target for a thoughtless joke," Oliver continued, voice stronger now, filled with quiet sincerity. "But now I understand profoundly the humanity beneath the uniform, the sacrifices, the silent dignity that deserves respect, never mockery." Oliver's eyes met Radcliffe's briefly, gratitude exchanged silently in the brief glance. "Today," Oliver continued powerfully, "we stand united, not as adversaries but as partners in restoring dignity, compassion, and empathy to a world often blinded by superficial fame." As Oliver paused momentarily, the the silence was abruptly shattered by a loud, aggressive voice cutting sharply through the air, echoing from the edge of the gathering. Oliver spun around quickly, his stomach tightening anxiously as he recognized Stanley Foster stepping forward, his once close friend whose betrayal had wounded Oliver deeply. Stanley stood defiantly, a sneer etched onto his familiar, yet now coldly hostile face. "This is ridiculous," Stanley shouted harshly, his voice dripping with mockery. "Are you really buying this act? Oliver Blake, hero of compassion." Stanley's laughter was bitter and sarcastic, aiming to undermine everything Oliver had painstakingly built. Oliver felt his stomach tighten painfully, humiliation surging fiercely within him. He stood frozen, eyes wide with shock, betrayed openly by a man he once considered a brother. Yet in that painful moment, something remarkable happened. Sergeant Radcliffe stepped calmly beside Oliver, placing a steady hand reassuringly upon his shoulder, silently reminding Oliver of their shared purpose. "Mr. Foster," Radcliffe began firmly, voice authoritative yet calm, "Oliver's past mistakes are undeniable, but sincerity isn't measured by our past, it's proven by our present. Compassion isn't earned through mockery, it's earned by courageously confronting our wrongdoings." The crowd murmured approvingly, encouraged by Radcliffe's words. Stanley, sensing defeat, stepped back slightly, bitterness evident yet silent now. Oliver felt a profound wave of gratitude toward Radcliffe, whose dignity and strength had shielded Oliver in his moment of vulnerability. Margaret rose gracefully, her voice quiet yet profoundly moving. "My son's actions hurt deeply, yes, but witnessing him endure sincere remorse and humility gives me faith that change and redemption are always possible." Her voice trembled softly with maternal pride and deep, enduring love. Oliver's heart swelled painfully, tears threatening once more, realizing profoundly the depth of support he'd earned through honesty, humility, and sincerity. Yet he knew this moment demanded more, an undeniable demonstration of his commitment. Turning quietly towards Sergeant Radcliffe, Oliver spoke firmly yet humbly, loud enough for all to hear. "Lewis, today I formally promise to dedicate my life to honoring your brother Samuel's memory. Through kindness, education, and compassion, I swear his legacy will endure. From today forward, every step I take will honor him and all innocent lives impacted by thoughtless cruelty." Radcliffe stepped forward quietly, extending a hand firmly towards Oliver, eyes softened by gratitude and profound respect. Oliver took it instantly, feeling a powerful sense of closure, an alliance forged through suffering, humility, and courage. The crowd applauded softly yet earnestly, moved deeply by Oliver's undeniable sincerity. As evening shadows deepened around them, Oliver knelt slowly before Rufus, whose gentle gaze welcomed him warmly, reassuringly. Oliver stroked the dog's soft fur tenderly, heart filled now with profound gratitude for Rufus's unwavering companionship, an animal who had forgiven instantly what humans found challenging. Oliver's heart swelled further, understanding clearly how animals, with their simple, pure hearts, guided humanity toward empathy and kindness. Yet, just as the moment seemed complete, Oliver's phone vibrated suddenly, a sharp, urgent interruption. Glancing down, Oliver's heart stopped instantly, anxiety flooding through him fiercely. A message illuminated brightly upon the screen. "We need to talk immediately. Meet me at Windsor Station alone." Oliver recognized the number instantly, fear gripping him mercilessly. Radcliffe, sensing Oliver's sudden distress, stepped closer, quietly concerned. "Oliver," he asked cautiously, noting Oliver's sudden pallor. Oliver hesitated, pulse quickening painfully as he met Radcliffe's gaze. "Something's wrong," he admitted softly, anxiety evident in his voice. Radcliffe nodded quietly, understanding the threat instinctively. "Then face it directly, Oliver, with courage, sincerity, and the dignity you've fought hard to reclaim." Oliver nodded resolutely, knowing Radcliffe was right. As he stepped carefully away from the gathered crowd, heart pounding fiercely, Oliver realized his journey was far from complete. The shadows he'd faced were but preparation for something darker yet to come. Stepping into the twilight, anxiety swirling fiercely within him, Oliver Blake knew he stood now at the precipice of a truth even darker and more challenging. The phone in his hand buzzed again urgently, warning silently that another test of his sincerity, courage, and empathy loomed ominously ahead. What hidden threat now awaited him in the shadows, prepared to test the sincerity he'd painstakingly forged? Oliver's path remained uncertain, filled with painful lessons yet necessary truths, his redemption incomplete until every shadow had been courageously confronted.